The young man's shoes were lined up perfectly on the bridge sidewalk. That should have been Morgan Freeman's first clue that this wasn't going to be an ordinary late-night walk across the Golden Gate Bridge. The fog was rolling in thick from the Pacific, wrapping around the towers like ghostly fingers, and most sane people had long since headed home. But there, standing at the rail in the exact center of the span, was a figure that seemed to belong more to the mist than to the solid world of steel and concrete. He was thin, maybe 25, wearing a worn denim jacket that looked like it had seen better decades, and jeans that were too big for his frame. His dark hair was tousled by the wind, and he gripped the railing with white knuckles as he stared down into the churning waters 245 feet below. Next to him, those shoes, clean white sneakers placed side by side with the kind of precision that suggested this moment had been planned for a long time. Morgan had been walking the bridge for years. After particularly difficult recording sessions, or when the weight of narrating humanity's darkest chapters got too heavy, he would drive to the bridge and walk its length, letting the Pacific wind clear his mind and remind him of the vastness that existed beyond Hollywood's small dramas. Tonight had been one of those sessions. 3 hours narrating a documentary about child soldiers in Africa. His voice carrying stories that no child should have to live, no adult should have to witness. The words had left him feeling hollow, questioning how much pain one voice could carry without breaking. But when he saw the young man at the rail, something shifted inside Morgan's chest. Not panic, but recognition. The kind of quiet desperation that had nothing to do with drama, and everything to do with the weight of believing you're alone in a world that doesn't understand your particular brand of pain. Morgan slowed his pace, studying the scene with the careful observation that had made him a master of understanding human stories. The shoes bothered him most. They suggested finality, preparation, a decision that had moved beyond impulse into careful planning. When he was close enough to speak without shouting over the wind, Morgan stopped walking entirely. "Beautiful night for a walk," he said simply, his voice carrying its familiar warmth but stripped of any performance. Just one person acknowledging another. The young man didn't turn around, but his shoulders tensed slightly. "Not many people out here this late," he replied, his voice carrying a slight tremor that might have been the cold, or might have been something else entirely. "No," Morgan agreed, moving to stand a few feet away, far enough to not feel threatening but close enough to be present. "I find the bridge peaceful at night. Helps me think." Think about what? It was such a simple question, but Morgan sensed it carried the weight of someone who had been thinking too much, about too many things, for too long. "Life, mostly," Morgan said. "The stories we tell ourselves about who we are, what we're worth, whether any of it matters in the end." The young man finally turned to look at him, and Morgan felt a familiar jolt of recognition that happened when people suddenly realized who they were talking to. But instead of starstruck excitement, he saw something closer to resignation. "You're Morgan Freeman," the young man said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Morgan replied. "And you are?" "David. David Chen." He paused, looking back toward the water. "I guess this is pretty surreal, meeting you here tonight when I'm about to." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The shoes, the positioning, the careful way he'd been gripping the rail. It all told the same story. Morgan felt something settle in his chest, not fear but a kind of calm certainty. This was why he'd been drawn to walk tonight. This was the story he was meant to be part of. "David," Morgan said, "would you mind if I joined you for a few minutes? I promise I'm not going to try to talk you out of anything or call anyone. I'd like to understand." David studied Morgan's face for a long moment, looking for the kind of false concern or celebrity obligation that might have motivated most famous people in this situation, but whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him. "Sure," David said, "though I should warn you, I'm not exactly great company right now." Morgan settled against the rail beside David, both men now facing the dark water below. The fog was getting thicker, muffling the sounds of the city behind them and creating a kind of intimate cocoon around their conversation. "Tell me about the shoes," Morgan said. David looked down at his carefully arranged sneakers and laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "My film school professor told us that details matter in storytelling, that every element should serve the narrative. I guess I wanted my ending to be neat." "Film school?" "USC, or was USC. I dropped out 3 months ago." David's hands tightened on the rail. "Turns out I'm not as good at telling stories as I thought I was." Morgan nodded slowly. "What kind of stories were you trying to tell?" "Real ones. Stories about people like me, first-generation immigrants, kids caught between two cultures, never quite belonging anywhere." David's voice grew stronger as he talked, as if the words themselves were giving him energy. "My parents came here from Taiwan when I was 2. Worked 18-hour days so I could have opportunities they never had. And I wanted to honor that, you know. Tell stories about the invisible people, the ones whose voices never get heard." "What happened?" David was quiet for a long moment, watching the fog swirl around the bridge's cables. "I spent 4 years working on a thesis film. Put everything I had into it, emotionally, financially, physically. It was about my grandfather, who died in Nabi Fiawas, a labor camp during the Cultural Revolution. A story about sacrifice, about the prices people pay for their children's futures." Morgan waited, sensing there was more. "It got rejected. By every festival, every screening opportunity, every person I submitted it to. The feedback was always the same. Technically competent but lacks emotional resonance. Well-meaning but doesn't connect with audiences. Too specific to be universal." The words hung in the fog like accusations. "So I started thinking," David continued, "maybe they're right. Maybe my stories don't matter. Maybe I'm just some kid who doesn't understand what real storytelling looks like. Maybe the world doesn't need another voice, especially not mine." Morgan felt something familiar stir in his chest, the same feeling he'd experienced countless times when reading scripts about human suffering, when narrating documentaries about people whose stories seemed too painful to bear yet too important to ignore. "David," Morgan said carefully, "can I tell you something about voices?" David nodded. "I've been narrating stories for 40 years, stories about war, injustice, triumph, loss. You name it, I probably put my voice to it. And do you know what I've learned in all that time?" "What?" "The stories that matter most are usually the ones that get rejected first. Because they're too real, too specific, too honest for people who are comfortable with safe, familiar narratives." Morgan turned to face David directly. "Every documentary I've ever narrated started with someone like you, someone who believed a particular story needed to be told, regardless of whether it was commercially viable or universally appealing. And most of those people were told no, repeatedly, before they found someone brave enough to say yes." "But what if they're right?" David's voice cracked slightly. "What if I'm just kidding myself? What if my grandfather's story, my parents' sacrifices, my whole perspective on what it means to be American, what if none of it resonates because it's not worth telling?" Morgan was quiet for a long moment, feeling the weight of this young man's pain as clearly as if it were his own. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of authority that came from decades of understanding the difference between stories that entertained and stories that transformed. "David, in 1989, I narrated a documentary called The Unfinished Civil Rights Movement. It took the filmmakers 8 years to get funding, because studios said the story was too niche, that audiences weren't interested in outdated racial narratives. That documentary went on to win 3 Emmys and fundamentally changed how America understood its own history. David was listening now with the intense focus of someone hearing something they desperately needed to understand. In 1995, I worked on a film about Japanese-American internment camps during World War II. Every major network passed on it, said it was too specific to the Asian American experience to have broad appeal. It ended up being watched by 12 million people and is now required viewing in high schools across the country. Morgan paused, letting the fog swirl around them for a moment before continuing. Your grandfather's story, your parents' sacrifice, your perspective on belonging. These aren't niche narratives, David. These are American stories. They're human stories. And the fact that some people in film school can't see their value says nothing about the stories themselves, and everything about the limitations of people who've never had to fight for their place in the world. David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. But what if I'm not good enough? What if I don't have the talent to do justice to these stories? Let me ask you something, Morgan said. Why did you want to tell your grandfather's story? Because, David's voice caught. Because he died believing that his sacrifice meant something, that his granddaughter and grandson would grow up in a country where their voices mattered, where their stories could be heard. And I wanted to prove he was right. David, Morgan said gently, that's not the voice of someone who doesn't understand storytelling. That's the voice of someone who understands exactly what stories are for. To honor the people who came before us and to create bridges for the people who come after us. The fog was beginning to lift slightly, revealing glimpses of the city lights beyond. David stared at them for a long time before speaking. Mr. Freeman, can I ask you something? Of course. Have you ever felt like giving up? Like maybe your voice didn't matter as much as everyone says it does? Morgan smiled, though David couldn't see it in the darkness. Every day for the first 10 years of my career, I was told my voice was too distinctive, that audiences would never be able to separate the narrator from the story. I was told to change my delivery, to sound more like what people expected a documentary narrator to sound like. What changed? I stopped trying to sound like someone else and started trusting that my voice, exactly as it was, had value. And slowly, I found people who understood that distinctive doesn't mean wrong. It means irreplaceable. David was quiet for a long time, staring at his shoes on the sidewalk. When he finally spoke, his voice was steadier than it had been all night. I think about my grandfather a lot. About how he never got to see America. Never got to know whether his sacrifice was worth it. And I wonder what he would think about me standing here, ready to throw away everything he died to give me. What do you think he would say? David laughed, and this time there was a hint of actual humor in it. He'd probably tell me to stop feeling sorry for myself and get back to work. He wasn't big on self-pity. Sounds like a wise man. He was. David turned to look at Morgan. Mr. Freeman, can I tell you about my film? The one that got rejected everywhere? For the next 2 hours, David Chen told Morgan Freeman about his grandfather's story. About a man who spent 3 years in a labor camp for the crime of believing his children deserved a better future. About parents who left everything they knew to give their son opportunities in a country where he would always be seen as other. About a young filmmaker trying to honor that legacy while finding his own place in the world. And Morgan listened with the same attention he brought to every story he'd ever narrated, understanding that this wasn't just about David or his grandfather. It was about the countless people whose stories go untold